All right, we're back again with the legendary Paul Watzlawick. Different book this time. How Real is Real. So I'll begin with the excerpt and then we'll get into the topic. If a horse receives a mild electric shock from a metal plate on the floor of its stall every time a bell rings, it will very soon come to associate the bell with the imminent shock and lift its hoof to avoid it. Once this conditioned reflex has been established, the shock mechanism can be turned off, and the horse will continue to lift its hoof whenever the bell rings. And every time it does this, the success of the action, i.e. the non-occurrence of the shock, further convinces it that lifting its hoof is the right reaction. It never learns that the bell is no longer followed by a shock. For all practical purposes, it has acquired a neurotic symptom, persisting in an action that once was appropriate but no longer is. And it need hardly be said, this kind of problem is by no means limited to animals. Okay. So, what's all that about? Well, as Paul alluded to at the end there, this is not about horses. This, arguably, is your life. Let me expand. When we're kids, we're aliens, basically. Everything is new. And all the information we accrue during childhood is communicating to us something about how to survive and how not to survive. What is advantageous to our survival and what is not. And depending on the kind of environment that we find ourselves in, we may be required, or the necessity may arise to adopt certain adaptations. Now, if you grow up in a peaceful environment, it may not be necessary to, or needed to, adopt any particularly stark or odd, strange or costly adaptations. But we're not all that lucky to grow up in that kind of environment. And so if you grow up in a chaotic environment or a highly stressful environment or one full of threats and danger, well then the necessity for these kinds of adaptations may be more essential. And these can take all sorts of different forms. It can be propensity to lie, propensity for violence, for aggression, propensity to censor yourself. The list is never ending. Now, we're not going to be so much focused on that stuff as it occurs in childhood today, but typically, those adaptations, if they persist for any reasonable length of time, it's because they serve a purpose and it's because they work. They solve some problem. Now, it may not look like that from the outside. It may be perceived as a nuisance or a problem to be solved. But that's often because you're missing something in terms of the larger context in which the kid exists. But later on, as you mature and you exit the home and you obtain independence from the adults that you formerly depended on for your survival, something is shifted there. You're formerly a dependent that leans on others in order to survive. once you mature and become an adult, this requirement is no longer there. You can fend for yourself, and there's more flexibility there. Now, what happens with all those adaptations you may have made, though? Well, what can happen, much like the horse in the experiment we began with, is that even though those adaptations you developed earlier in life may have been useful to you, without being consciously aware of it necessarily, you may continue to rely on those behaviors or those thought patterns as you enter adulthood. Now, this can pose an issue because, as we just outlined, your environment has changed. The circumstances in which you exist have changed because you're no longer dependent, and you may no longer be in the same kind of high-stress environment that you grew up in. And this is where what was once an advantageous adaptation, or at least a useful one, becomes a source of problems in and of itself. That if you're not aware of, will begin to produce issues rather than help prevent or account for them. So if you don't recognize or realize this shift in the context that occurred, much like the horse, you don't realize that the need for the lifting of the hoof is no longer necessary. That's the adaptation. And for yourself, whether it's, again, perpetual lying, self-censorship, aggression, if you don't realize that the environment in which you were shaped or encouraged to make those adaptations has fallen away, has changed, then you're going to be applying this strategy in a domain in which it no longer makes sense, which is going to produce problems for you, likely. So to reiterate, the key is to recognize the shift in context, shift in environment, and that you can perhaps be thankful or compassionate about your previous self in having had to make these adaptations. But now coming to a point where you can potentially let go of these things, realize or recognize that you no longer need them because the context has changed. And although in the past they were an advantage to you, solving problems potentially or preventing problems, now they're a source of issues because they're being misapplied. So the question is, can we remove these things, or can we substitute them with something else? But if you don't make these connections, then you're stuck in a kind of repetition compulsion, where you're, for lack of a better word or phrasing, you're kind of stuck in the past, because you're living a life that no longer applies to the present. So your maturity has been stunted some way if you don't get this. And part of therapy often is making this conscious to you, when formerly it was not. And this can take some time. It's hard to unlearn this when it feels perfectly natural to you. Like trying to forget how to speak English if it's your native tongue. But it can be done, but it just requires conscious effort and repetition. So that's all I really wanted to mention. I just love that, the horse experiment example, although it's rather cruel, it is instructive to us human beings. And we're not so different. Our adaptations are more elaborate than just lifting a limb. But nonetheless, the basic pattern remains largely the same, that you, in a sense, you're relying on a superstition to function. Are you capable of letting that go? But to do that, first it can be helpful to understand why you developed it in the first place. To do that, you got to look at your history.